He had resisted her look, he had resisted her words, but the magnetic fascination of her touch conquered him at the final moment. "I can't leave you," he said, holding helplessly by the hand she had given him. "What must I do?" "Come and see," she answered, without allowing him an instant to reflect. Closing her hand firmly on his, she led him along the first floor corridor to the room numbered 4. "Notice that room," she whispered. After a look over the stairs, to see that they were alone, she retraced her steps with him to the opposite extremity of the corridor. Here, facing the window which lit the place at the other end, was one little room, with a narrow grating in the higher part of the door, intended for the sleeping apartment of the doctor's deputy. From the position of this room, the grating commanded a view of the bedchambers down each side of the corridor, and so enabled the deputy physician to inform himself of any irregular proceedings on the part of the patients under his care, with little or no chance of being detected in watching them. Miss Gwilt opened the door and led the way into the empty room. "Wait here," she said, "while I go back upstairs, and lock yourself in if you like. You will be in the dark, but the gas will be burning in the corridor. Keep at the grating, and make sure that Mr. Armadale goes into the room I have just pointed out to you, and that he doesn't leave it afterward. If you lose sight of the room for a single moment before I come back, you will repent it to the end of your life. If you do as I tell you, you shall see me to morrow, and claim your own reward. Quick with your answer! Is it yes or no?" He could make no reply in words. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it rapturously. She left him in the room. From his place at the grating he saw her glide down the corridor to the staircase door. She passed through it and locked it. Then there was silence. The next sound was the sound of the women servants' voices. 2 of them came up to put the sheets on the beds in number 3 and number 4. The women were in high good humor, laughing and talking to each other through the open doors of the rooms. The master's customers were coming in at last, they said, with a vengeance. The house would soon begin to look cheerful, if things went on like this. After a little, the beds were got ready, and the women returned to the kitchen floor, on which the sleeping rooms of the domestic servants were all situated. Then there was silence again. The next sound was the sound of the doctor's voice. He appeared at the end of the corridor, showing Allan and Midwinter the way to their rooms. They all went together into number 4. After a little while, the doctor came out first. He waited till Midwinter joined him, and pointed with a formal bow to the door of number 3. Midwinter entered the room without speaking, and shut himself in. The doctor, left alone, withdrew to the staircase door and unlocked it, then waited in the corridor, whistling to himself softly under his breath. Voices pitched cautiously low became audible in a minute more in the hall. The resident dispenser and the head nurse appeared, on their way to the dormitories of the attendants at the top of the house. The man bowed silently and passed the doctor. The woman curtsied silently and followed the man. The doctor acknowledged their salutations by a courteous wave of his hand, and once more left alone paused a moment, still whistling softly to himself, then walked to the door of number 4, and opened the case of the fumigating apparatus fixed near it in the corner of the wall. As he lifted the lid and looked in, his whistling ceased. He took a long purple bottle out, examined it by the gaslight, put it back, and closed the case. This done, he advanced on tiptoe to the open staircase door, passed through it, and secured it on the inner side as usual. Mr. Bashwood had seen him at the apparatus. Mr. Bashwood had noticed the manner of his withdrawal through the staircase door. Again the sense of unutterable expectation throbbed at his heart. A terror that was slow and cold and deadly crept into his hands, and guided them in the dark to the key that had been left for him in the inner side of the door. He turned it in vague distrust of what might happen next, and waited. The slow minutes passed, and nothing happened. The silence was horrible. The solitude of the lonely corridor was a solitude of invisible treacheries. He began to count to keep his mind employed, to keep his own growing dread away from him. The numbers, as he whispered them, followed each other slowly up to 100, and still nothing happened. He had begun the second 100. He had got on to 20 when, without a sound to betray that he had been moving in his room, Midwinter suddenly appeared in the corridor. He stood for a moment and listened. He went to the stairs and looked over into the hall beneath. Then for the second time that night he tried the staircase door, and for the second time found it fast. After a moment's reflection, he tried the doors of the bedrooms on his right hand next, looked into one after the other, and saw that they were empty, then came to the door of the end room in which the steward was concealed. Here again the lock resisted him. He listened and looked up at the grating. No sound was to be heard, no light was to be seen inside. "Shall I break the door in," he said to himself, "and make sure? No, it would be giving the doctor an excuse for turning me out of the house." He moved away and looked into the two empty rooms in the row occupied by Allan and himself, then walked to the window at the staircase end of the corridor. Here the case of the fumigating apparatus attracted his attention. After trying vainly to open it, his suspicion seemed to be aroused. He searched back along the corridor, and observed that no object of a similar kind appeared outside any of the other bedchambers. Again at the window, he looked again at the apparatus, and turned away from it with a gesture which plainly indicated that he had tried and failed to guess what it might be. Baffled at all points, he still showed no sign of returning to his bedchamber. He stood at the window, with his eyes fixed on the door of Allan's room, thinking. If Mr. Bashwood, furtively watching him through the grating, could have seen him at that moment in the mind as well as in the body, Mr. Bashwood's heart might have throbbed even faster than it was throbbing now, in expectation of the next event which Midwinter's decision of the next minute was to bring forth. On what was his mind occupied as he stood alone, at the dead of night, in the strange house? His mind was occupied in drawing its disconnected impressions together, little by little, to one point. Convinced from the first that some hidden danger threatened Allan in the Sanitarium, his distrust, vaguely associated thus far with the place itself, with his wife, whom he firmly believed to be now under the same roof with him, with the doctor, who was as plainly in her confidence as Mr. Bashwood himself, now narrowed its range and centered itself obstinately in Allan's room. Resigning all further effort to connect his suspicion of a conspiracy against his friend with the outrage which had the day before been offered to himself, an effort which would have led him, if he could have maintained it, to a discovery of the fraud really contemplated by his wife, his mind, clouded and confused by disturbing influences, instinctively took refuge in its impressions of facts as they had shown themselves since he had entered the house. Everything that he had noticed below stairs suggested that there was some secret purpose to be answered by getting Allan to sleep in the Sanitarium. Everything that he had noticed above stairs associated the lurking place in which the danger lay hid with Allan's room. To reach this conclusion, and to decide on baffling the conspiracy, whatever it might be, by taking Allan's place, was with Midwinter the work of an instant. Confronted by actual peril, the great nature of the man intuitively freed itself from the weaknesses that had beset it in happier and safer times. Not even the shadow of the old superstition rested on his mind now. No fatalist suspicion of himself disturbed the steady resolution that was in him. The one last doubt that troubled him, as he stood at the window thinking, was the doubt whether he could persuade Allan to change rooms with him, without involving himself in an explanation which might lead Allan to suspect the truth. In the minute that elapsed while he waited with his eyes on the room, the doubt was resolved. He found the trivial yet sufficient excuse of which he was in search. Mr. Bashwood saw him rouse himself and go to the door. Mr. Bashwood heard him knock softly and whisper, "Allan, are you in bed?" "No," answered the voice inside. "Come in." He appeared to be on the point of entering the room, when he checked himself, as if he had suddenly remembered something. "Wait a minute," he said through the door, and turning away, went straight to the end room. "If there is anybody watching us in there," he said aloud, "let him watch us through this." He took out his handkerchief and stuffed it into the wires of the grating, so as to completely close the aperture. Having thus forced the spy inside, if there was one, either to betray himself by moving the handkerchief, or to remain blinded to all view of what might happen next, Midwinter presented himself in Allan's room. "You know what poor nerves I have," he said, "and what a wretched sleeper I am at the best of times. I can't sleep to-night. The window in my room rattles every time the wind blows. I wish it was as fast as your window here." "My dear fellow," cried Allan, "I don't mind a rattling window. Let's change rooms." "Nonsense! Why should you make excuses to me?" Don't I know how easily trifles upset those excitable nerves?